Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is local historian and creator of the Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites around communities in the state of Mass. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing around Wistariahurst in Holyoke, Mass. So what is of interest on the Beach Street area side of Wistariahurst?
Okay, so yes, it's surrounded by 4 different streets on this rectangular structure that the lower section of Holyoke has. And so it has Beach, Cabot, Pine, and Hampshire Street are surrounded. And we're going to tell you about those in terms of what's outside. If you're on the sidewalk, look out from the block. So most people know very well on the city block is beautiful William Skinner's house, Wistariahurst, which was brought from Williamsburg in 1874. And that's why the house itself has no architectural look to the houses around it at all. It also takes up a whole city block because he was given that. But the homes around it developed through time. Now on the Beach Street side, sadly the best home of all, burned in a fire December 18th, 1973. The 6 occupants of the home were awakened by a baby crying on the first floor, and the fire department was called, and they couldn't put a fire out, so it destroyed the whole building. And that building was made in 1885 by the George Clark, who was a treasurer of the Newton Paper Company. He had built up here because it was so nice, and it was the first home besides Wistariahurst to be put in this place. And it's the first home within 3 blocks of Wistariahurst to be built there. Wistariahurst was never built there, it was built in Williamsburg. Sadly, I have pictures of it, but sadly the building's gone. It had a brick facade on both floors, and it was a gorgeous building. The Clark family, besides the husband, had a son, George Clark Jr., and he would become a medical doctor based out of Boston and specialize in diseases. And the family would live there for about maybe about 60 years, and then it would transfer over to being apartments. All right, so it's a great start. Now, the next street coming along, we're going to go in clockwise fashion. So the next street coming along is
Cabot.
All right. So the features on Cabot Street that we're going to emphasize is diagonally across the tip of Cabot and Beach. There's a home there which was built in 1885 also. So 2 homes were built right away across Cabot and Beach, and they complemented very well the Wistariahurst. This one was Henry Seymour home. He was the head of his own company called Seymour Cutlery, and then it was taken over by Samuel Whiten, who was the son of William Whiten, who was a very famous person in the history of Holyoke, probably one of the most famous of all, or at least top 5. And his son was no slouch. He took over the mills, and he also was involved in the political structure of Massachusetts itself. A little bit up Cabot Street, you can see in the distance a portion of Oak Street called Fairmount Square, but across Cabot Street at Oak, you'll find the Nautilus, which used to be a Victorian home, and using that as a base, that home was surrounded by bricks, and then an addition as large as the home itself was put on towards the east, and it became the Nautilus, a newspaper, a magazine, and it stayed around Holyoke for about 70 years. Now, Cabot Street itself has more, but they're at the tip of Pine, so that's going to be our next point.
But quickly, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org, and there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for other inquiries or private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, how about on Pine Street?
All right. So near the corner of Cabot and Pine Street, there's many nice homes. Right on Pine Street itself, at that corner, is the McCarthy home, and that was built in the later portions of the 1880s. J.J. McCarthy lived there with his wife, and when she died, she was so beloved around Holyoke that there was a lot of people that were very upset when she died. Her husband was a bar owner. He was very social. She was the head of a couple of choral groups within Holyoke, and two of her daughters were elementary school teachers within Holyoke. And so a lot of people knew this family. And when she died, many, many hundreds of flower bouquets were sent, enough that it filled every room on the second floor, every room on the first floor, the entire wraparound porch, and then the entire lawn front inside. Hundreds of flowers were sent. When J.J. McCarthy died 15 years later, they said in the obituary, "Do not send flowers." So this home was very, very popular. Across Cabot in the same direction was the Herbert Frink house. He was the owner of the Holyoke Machine Company, a company that made turbines and other machinery for the textile and paper mills of Holyoke. And they stayed in existence for 150 years in Holyoke and only moved last year. So it was started and it grew as Holyoke grew greatly. Now, that home, Frank home, was from 1885. And two houses down, there was another home, the Stern home, also made in 1885. And across the street from both of those homes I've mentioned, but in the middle of them, was a Reverend's home, and that was from 1885. So 5 houses came in 1885, 11 years after the Wistariahurst was put around there. So a lot of changes happened around there. Remember, there was no trees in this section of Holyoke, and so William Skinner could go in the second story of his home, look out and see the canals and see his business, and that's not true anymore. Now, one more very important home on Pine Street, and that was the George Brakey home, the first of the brick facade smaller homes along Pine. And he was William Skinner's a personal carriage driver, and then when cars came around, he was a personal chauffeur. And William Skinner actually bought out this house from Brakey, and Brakey and one of his sons was the chauffeur of the Skinner family up to 1943. And so from 1890, early 1890s to then, about a half century, this Brakey family was tightly combined with Skinner's family. And in fact, George Brakey was not only the chauffeur, but he was also the head of the men staff at the Wistariahurst. So this family was very tightly intertwined. And his son, one of his sons, got married in the garden of Wistariahurst. And so this is a very important house, probably one of the most modest, but probably one of the most tightly tied in to Wistariahurst and the Skinner family.
And last but not least, how about Hampshire Street?
Now here we have to leave from being very residential to being institution-based. Across the street from 1896 to about 1968 was the 4th edition of Holyoke High School. And in 1964, it did move up Beach Street a bit to its new home, but in 1968, it burned to the ground, and very sadly, because it was a gorgeous school built by the most prolific architect and construction firm in Holyoke, for institutions, and that was George Alderman. And beyond that was the auditorium gymnasium for Holyoke High School. And then in that same block beyond it was also the Holyoke Trade School, where vocational instruction was given, and that became Dean Technical School. All three of them are long gone, so it's now a block that have modern institutions. So you had a beautiful view. If you were around here about 1900, you would have beautiful new homes on three sides. And on the last side, the Hampshire Street side, you would have gorgeous institutions. So what a block it became. But when it started out in 1874, very simple, a big home on its own city block with a beautiful garden. And it's still, of course, one of the most visited locations in all of Holyoke.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check more of his podcasts on his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new videos and podcasts posted daily. Thank you for tuning in.